Welcome to 5 at 5 with Stone Law Offices. I'm attorney Brendan Bybee with 5 minutes on bypass trusts. What is a bypass trust? When we are dealing with married couples, we often include tax planning provisions, especially if you are a person who has a great deal of wealth. We have an estate tax in our country that applies at the federal level for very large estates. Now, the estate tax exemption right now is quite large. It doesn't affect very many people, but it does affect some people. And because that tax law is subject to change, that exemption can be reduced so that it may be that many more of us will have to have a concern about the estate tax. So oftentimes when we're dealing with trusts and we're dealing with that tax planning, there is a provision for a bypass trust, may be referred to as a family trust, or it may be referred to as an exemption trust. This has been a part of planning for a long period of time. In fact, early on, where now we use a lot of flexible planning provisions, depending on the scenario, it was very typical for a trust to divide up and fund a bypass trust to use up the exemption. That's why they call it the exemption amount, use up the estate tax exemption for the deceased spouse, with the rest of the property passing to the surviving spouse. So a bypass trust, like I said, is generally going to be a trust that becomes irrevocable on the death of that deceased spouse, and is going to leave so much of that deceased spouse's property as is needed to reach the estate tax exemption amount. Basically, it secures their estate tax exemption, allows the property in that bypass trust to then continue growing without accruing an estate tax in the end, so that the exemption isn't lost, so that the growth is secured against during the lifetime of the survivor against any estate taxation. And then, generally speaking, can but does not have to, but can and usually does continue to exist for the benefit of the surviving spouse, so that they can have property as they need to support their lifestyle, and then pass on to their chosen beneficiaries after the fact. That bypass trust may be amendable or not through something called a power of appointment by the surviving spouse, depending on how it was set up and what the people who created it decided they wanted to do. But ultimately, it's an irrevocable trust. It may exist for the children or for a surviving spouse, but it's created to secure that estate tax exemption, secure the growth of those assets over time, so that they remain outside of the estate outside of estate taxation, and can then pass on later on. Because they're irrevocable trusts, there are usually very limited ways to be able to make changes to them. But there can, in some cases, be an ability for a surviving spouse to modify the ultimate distribution of those trusts, depending on how they are funded and what the spouse has decided to do. If your spouse has passed away and you haven't done any trust administration, it may be that there's a bypass trust that is required to be funded by your trust under its terms, and you need to be careful what you do to make sure that those expectations are fulfilled, that the trust terms are followed as well. You need to make sure, if you have a bypass trust that's being administered, that you administer it in a way according to its terms, being that it's an irrevocable trust, to ensure both that the asset protection and tax planning provisions and expectations of that are going to be upheld and to your benefit, and to make sure that you are, just in all ways, following the terms of the trust and not causing any issues of a breach of duty or anything like that. If you have questions about your bypass trust, or whether there is some process there that you skipped after your spouse passed away, and want to know if that bypass trust needs to be funded or is part of your trust, or if you have questions about tax planning and want to see if your trust needs to have a bypass trust provision put in there to make sure that estate tax is avoided to the extent possible, let us know. We can look at your trust, or we can put together your estate planning so that it can benefit from these things to the extent necessary and the extent you like.